What if everything we've been taught about Satan's origin is incorrect? What if the narrative we've heard about rebellion, pride, and defiance was actually a misreading of something much deeper, something more tragic? What if the devil wasn't born out of rebellion, but rejection? This isn't simply a question intended to pique curiosity. This is a question that upsets everything we're familiar with: evil, good, and the universal conflict between light and darkness. Imagine it. Ancient Ethiopian monks, clad in their habit robes, on their knees in awe as they slowly unroll a sacred text. Incense hangs heavy in the air, candlelight casting an ethereal glow on the parchment. These monks possess one of Christianity's most significant and forbidden books, the Ethiopian Bible. This old manuscript is not another set of religious texts. It is the oldest and most comprehensive Bible canon in the knowledge of humankind, containing secrets that the Western world has either forgotten or intentionally overlooked. The Ethiopian Bible contains a treasure of esoteric knowledge. For many centuries, its books were too provocative, too potent, and too risky for general use. Unlike the canon we're familiar with, the Western Bible, which is largely shaped by European and Roman influences, the Ethiopian Bible includes writings that shed light on biblical figures, events, and concepts that are barely touched upon elsewhere. Among these forgotten texts are hints that suggest a different origin for Satan, one that is less about rebellion and more about rejection, heartbreak, and divine sorrow. What if Satan's tale was not one of pride, but of suffering? What if he was not expelled for desiring to be like God, but because he was wept for and abandoned by the Creator himself? What if Satan's fall was not a fall of ambition, but of grief and abandonment? And what if that grief was the start of his fall into the darkness we see him associated with today? These concepts may not be easy to harmonize with the ancient scripture regarding Satan, but the Bible of the Ethiopian people provides an alternative view, one which dares us to examine further into the character of evil, the origin of it, and the continued influence today in our lives. Satan is normally seen as a pure evil creature, a being always evil. But the Ethiopian Bible and its ancient texts suggest that his story may be far more complex than we've been led to believe. His transformation from light to darkness might not be a story of rebellion against God's authority, but a story of tragedy. A being who fell from grace not because of his own pride, but because he became the embodiment of God's sorrow. This change in perspective has profound implications for how we view the nature of evil in our day. In a world of racial injustice, spiritual warfare, and moral ambiguity, the possibility that evil may be conceived in rejection and sorrow instead of defiance is a disturbing one. It implies that the forces of darkness may not always be as distinct as we've been led to think. Perhaps the origin of Satan is connected with something much more human than we have ever considered. A broken-hearted celestial entity, forsaken and not understood, rejected by the very God he had served before. Following this concept, we come to the juncture. Do we retain Satan as the archetypal figure of evil, the rebel against God and the fallen angel? Or do we rethink his origin, not as a tale of pride and disobedience, but as a tale of abiding divine sorrow? How would this alter how we view him, how we struggle against the powers of darkness in our world, and how we comprehend the battles we struggle with daily? We also need to think about how this new perspective could affect the problems of today, like racism and spiritual warfare. If Satan's tale is not one of rebellion but of sadness, we might start seeing evil differently, not only as that which is against good, but as that which is born out of deep sorrow and brokenness. In our world today, where so much of what we encounter is based on division, fear, and misunderstanding, this change in viewpoint might enable us to view the world through a more compassionate lens. So, what does it mean for us today? It is that knowing the real origin of Satan may not only alter our perception of evil, it may alter how we deal with the issues we are confronted with in the world. It may bring new doors of healing, forgiveness, and comprehension. I mean, if the devil's downfall was conceived in sorrow and rejection, perhaps the key to defeating him isn't merely overcoming pride, but overcoming the deeper hurts of the human heart. Subscribe to Bible Says for more profound biblical enigmas, and if you feel called, bless us with a super thanks. What if Satan's origin wasn't rebellion, but divine sorrow? Would you still see him the same way? At the center of ancient Ethiopia is a tapestry of rich and unrevealed history, one long shrouded in secrecy, but still pertinent to grasping the origins of biblical truth. Aksum, the ancient city once a vibrant center of culture and religion, was the birthplace of a civilization that boasts having held on to the most pure and uncorrupted form of Scripture. Here, the traditions of the Ark of the Covenant, the Solomonic dynasty, and holy writings not included in Western Bibles take their origins. Ethiopia's sacred canon comprises books such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and verse Meqabyan, all of which provide an entirely different perspective on biblical history and spirituality than what we are used to in the Western tradition. The Book of Enoch, a group of early Jewish literature written in the name of the great patriarch Enoch, forms a foundation of Ethiopian scripture. This book, which the Western Church teaches is apocryphal, shows a deeper cosmic conflict, speaking of the fall of angels and their dealings with man and the prophecy of a future judgment. Enoch's works illuminate many of the secrets the Western canon passes over, including the Nephilim, the giants who populated the earth in the past, and the origin of evil. The Book of Jubilees, another banned book, provides a close recounting of biblical history, offering an alternate chronology that sheds new light on the narratives of Noah, Abraham, and Moses. The word Meqabyan, commonly known as the Ethiopian equivalent of the biblical Maccabees, narrates the Maccabean revolt, but with further dimensions of history and spiritual depth lacking in the Western version. For millennia, Ethiopia has boasted of having untainted scripture, something that sounds profoundly resonant to those who think the Western Bible, formed by centuries of translation, politics, and religious consolidation, has lost a few of its early truths. Ethiopian Christianity believes it was on their soil, far beyond Roman and Byzantine reach, that the original books were protected from corruption. Here, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, are those ancient texts retained as sacred today, and where the teachings of early Christianity remain preserved in their most unadulterated and pure state. One aspect of Ethiopia's religious heritage is its association with the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, in Ethiopian tradition, was taken to their country by Menelik I, the offspring of King Solomon and Sheba's queen, following a visit by the queen to Solomon in Jerusalem. This potent symbol, said to hold within it the stone tablets inscribed with God's commandments, is reported to have stayed in Ethiopia ever since, secreted in a holy chapel at Aksum. This identification of the Ark of the Covenant with the Solomonic dynasty enhances Ethiopia's argument for upholding biblical authenticity. The Solomonic dynasty, whose roots run directly back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, is the heart of Ethiopia's national and religious identity. Belief that the Ark was preserved and transmitted through the ages enhances the conviction that Ethiopia has the key to safeguarding the authentic heritage of ancient Israel. The Western world has traditionally kept the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other such works outside their canon, usually based on their lack of apostolic authority or because they belong to apocryphal teachings. The choice to omit these books from Western Bibles was primarily driven by the early Church Fathers, who sought to solidify the canon and remove any writings that did not fit into the emerging doctrine of the Church. Yet in Ethiopia, these very same books are not only recognized, but are viewed as an integral part of Scripture. This divergence also points out the differing trajectories of Christianity in the East and the West, and it forces one to question the real nature of biblical authenticity and authority. Perhaps most interestingly, Ethiopia's canon presents a different account of the history of Satan. In the Ethiopian canon, Satan's origins are more complex than they have been depicted in Western Christianity. While the Western account of Satan's fall from grace centers on his pride and rebellion against God, the Ethiopian scriptures tell a different, more melancholy story. In this account, Satan is not merely a figure of evil resulting from defiance, but a tragic figure whose actions are bound up with deeper cosmic forces. The book of Enoch, for instance, offers the possibility that the fallen angels, the Watchers, corrupted humanity not because they sought power, but because they fell from grace in a tragic and sorrowful manner with regret. This change of viewpoint creates new possibilities for the nature of evil and the roles of rejection and sorrow in the cosmic order. Ethiopia's conservation of these ancient documents, their link to the Ark of the Covenant, and their distinctive knowledge of Satan's beginning, encourage us to rethink the past we have been taught. The Ethiopian Bible forces us to reconsider the traditional version and presents an alternative, new perspective from which to look at the enigmas of the Bible. It reminds us that the history of Christianity is not single, but multifaceted, encompassing various cultures and traditions with important fragments of a far larger picture. As we burrow deeper into the unrevealed secrets of Ethiopia, we are encouraged to question what we believe, seek out the unreported stories, and reveal the secrets long withheld from the world at large. Before there was the rebellion that caused Satan to fall from grace, there was a day when he went by the name Hillel, the light bringer. Isaiah 14:12 references a fallen angel who was originally high and lifted up, establishing a dramatic juxtaposition between the creature he used to be and the enemy that he became. Hillel, in his youth, was a creature of uncommon beauty and strength, selected by God as a protector of his throne. His mission was evident and divine, commissioned with the protection of the heavens, a duty both an honor and a privilege. This was not a being born of malice or rebellion, but one born to represent God's glory, a shining being whose very name, Light Bringer, implied his place in the universe as a sign of divine light and order. But the Ethiopian texts, giving a different and usually more subtle account of the origin of Satan, present us with a picture of a creature who fell not through ordinary pride, but through profound cosmic sorrow. They tell of a pre-fall sorrow, an inner load which oppressed Hillel many ages before he became the symbol of evil. In these ancient texts, we observe a creature who, while lofty, wrestled with a deep sense of loneliness and aloneness. His stories of how he came to be imply that Hillel was not just a minion of God, but a being who yearned for a greater intimacy, one that would fill the developing void he came to experience. The act of creating man, specifically, was a turning point in Satan's inner conflict. When man was created, it was apparent to Hillel that his position in the celestial hierarchy was being eclipsed. Where he had long been alone as the brightest of all created entities, now there were entities created in God's likeness, with the capacity for love and free will beyond that which Hillel, all his majesty notwithstanding, could exert. This existential crisis was the spark for a complicated state of emotional turmoil within him. He started questioning, why had he, a creature so dear to God, been positioned in this role that now appeared secondary to these feeble new human beings? There was a sense of injustice that percolated in his head, an emotional bewilderment that started brewing within him. He had been compelled to serve, but now, watching the humans be granted favor, there was part of him wondering whether he was less than they were, less important in God's eyes. This internal conversation, a combination of loneliness, bewilderment, and a sense of wanting importance, was the start of the transformation of Satan. His grief, based on his desire for greater fellowship with God, gradually turned into pride. The more he thought of himself and his station in the overall scheme of things in the universe, the more he believed he was worthy of something more, something higher than the position of a servant. This was not merely a naively rebellious move out of ego and jealousy, but was a highly emotional and inward thing. He was a soul caught between loving the divine as much as he did and feeling rejected by it. He wanted to know why he, the light bringer, created to be so light, was relegated to the shade of these other creatures. Pride fueled by resentment grew along with it. The grief he had once experienced became turned into bitterness against God, and he began to doubt the very basis of his life. The relationship that had once been present between Hillel and the Creator started breaking apart, and the seeds of rebellion were born. Hillel, now Satan, no longer saw himself as a servant of God, but as a being worthy of greater power, a force that could challenge God's authority. This is the tragic paradox of Satan's fall. It began not as a desire for destruction or evil, but as a longing for belonging, a desire for significance, and the overwhelming pain of cosmic isolation. In this redesigned origin of Satan, we have a creature who was not born the embodiment of evil, but was rather formed by his inner conflicts, emotional anguish, and feeling of being ill understood. His descent into sin was not a mere change from good to bad, but an in-depth change from sadness to arrogance, from universal loneliness to an endless hunger for domination. The pride that ultimately engulfed him was not the pride of a mindless insurgent, but the pride of a once great being whose inner conflict ultimately befogged his judgment and led him to a disastrous decision. From this perspective, Satan's fall is a tragic tale of loneliness, rejection, and the corrupting influence of pride. It is a story of a being who, despite his closeness to God, could not reconcile his own place in the grand order of creation. It reminds us that even beings created for great purposes can fall prey to emotional struggles, doubts, and insecurities. It encourages us to re-examine the nature of evil, not as something essentially evil, but as something that may arise out of pain, loneliness, and a yearning for an ultimate bond that is never consummated. The idea of a black Jesus is regularly dismissed within Western theology as an instance of race tokenism or a desperate effort to retroactively apply modern racial identities to figures in the Bible. But within the world of Ethiopian Christianity, Christ is imagined as a black king, an image that rings true to the historical and theological realities that find their source on the African continent. Ethiopia, being one of the world's oldest Christian countries, has a tradition that welcomes the intimate relationships between Jesus Christ and the people of Africa. These representations are not merely cultural, but theological affirmations of Christ's universality. For centuries, the Ethiopian Church has celebrated Christ in this manner, affirming the belief that Jesus is not subject to the racial limitations that have so often fragmented humanity, but is rather the Savior of all peoples. Theologically, the black Jesus is a rich affirmation of Christ's acceptance of every human being, irrespective of color or ethnicity, affirming the inclusiveness of the divine plan. When examining the first war in heaven, the battle between Lucifer, who later becomes Satan, and God, it is important to approach this event not as a simple tale of rebellion or a clash of armies, but rather as a deeply emotional and relational rupture. In this context, the story becomes less about a militaristic coup and more about the painful dynamics of love, pride, and loss. The Ethiopic Book of Enoch, which is not part of the Western canon, but is held sacred by Ethiopian Christians, contextualizes this first heavenly war as a love story of hurt rather than one of simple rebellion. Satan's refusal to bow down to man was not a product of simple pride or ambition, but of a profound and hurtful heartbreak. In Ethiopian tradition, Satan's fall is portrayed as a sad story of disappointment by God and rejection by his person. Lucifer, who was a creature made to mirror God's glory, had found himself in disarray when the human was created. It was not just that he felt inferior to human beings or jealous of their place in creation, but more that he felt a deep emotional rift in his relationship with God. He had been made to be near to the divine, a cherubim with power and beauty, but the making of mankind seemed to mean a change in the divine plan that made him feel forsaken and unloved. The love which he had once had for God, a love so pure and bright, now appeared to be elsewhere. This feeling of rejection was not merely an affront to his ego, but a painful wound to his heart, one which cut him off from the divine and made him rebel. The Ethiopian writings teach that Satan's revolt was based on this emotional anguish, not on a mere lust for power. His refusal to bow to man was not pride alone, it was a cry of heartbreak. To him, the creation of man was an act of divine betrayal, a betrayal of the special position he had held in God's favor. The story implies that Satan's sorrow was so intense that it warped his originally beautiful nature, making him the enemy who would eventually personify evil and chaos. His rebellion was not a strategic act of seeking power, but a response to the crippling loss of a love that he had once valued. This internal conflict, a blend of sadness and disarray, set him along a course of rebellion, not only against man, but ultimately against God himself. The Ethiopian account of the initial war in heaven provides us with a more detailed understanding of Satan's fall. Instead of a militaristic coup led by an arrogant entity looking for control, it makes the event a relational breakdown, the tale of a being who was betrayed by God's choice to exalt mankind. The story implies that the position of Satan as a guardian in heaven was previously the height of God's confidence. But with the introduction of man, he was at war with the same creator he used to worship. It was not just because of pride or envy, but a profound emotional fault line that destroyed the heavenly harmony in heaven. The hurt of rejection, coupled with the knowledge that he could no longer be as intimate with God, was what prompted Satan to stand against both mankind and the Creator. This was not motivated by a desire for power, but by the pain of being displaced in God's heart. The Book of Enoch from Ethiopia also illuminates the thought that Satan's minions, the fallen angels, were also brought into this revolt by their own emotional distress. They also had experienced the pain of rejection and the emotional allure of Satan's anguish. Together, they became accomplices to the relational breakdown between heaven and earth, one that would result in the fall of the angels and ultimately the corruption of humanity. This is not merely a struggle of forces or ideologies, but a struggle of shattered relationships and emotional hurt. The first war in heaven, then, is not a story of military victories or struggle for power, but one of lost love and the destructive impact of divine rejection. Within this context, Satan's fall is not a simplistic fall into evil, but an intricate, emotional journey of a bruised heart, rejection, and betrayal of divine love. The Ethiopian worldview invites us to see the cosmic conflict not merely in terms of good and evil, but as a tale of suffering, loss, and the repercussions of a fractured relationship between the Creator and his creation. This understanding of Satan's rebellion, one that is based on heartbreak, enables us to view the fallen angel in a more sympathetic light, one that captures the multifaceted emotional terrain that all creatures, divine or not, must travel in, the face of rejection and loss. The Watcher's story is one of the most enigmatic and fascinating stories in biblical and apocryphal literature, especially in the Book of Enoch. These angels who come down from heaven are not only messengers of God, but also creatures with immense knowledge and power. We learn in Genesis 6 of the sons of God marrying human wives, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim, giants who inhabited the earth. This cryptic reference within the canonical Bible is elaborated upon in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch, where the Watchers are detailed more fully. In this account, these angels fall to earth not in rebellion, but because of a heavenly decision to share their knowledge with humans. This knowledge, however, is not of the sort that human beings were intended to have. These forbidden arts, magic, astrology, and metallurgy are what the Watchers impart. They are basically opening up the secrets of heaven to be revealed. Their activities, though appearing harmless at first, have catastrophic results. The world becomes polluted, and human moral fiber starts to disintegrate as they abuse the knowledge that has been bestowed upon them. The Watchers, originally intended to advise and guard, now become the cause of the downfall of humanity. The flood, subsequently sent as a judgment from God, is a direct result of this sin. The fallen angels chained in their prison are a poignant reminder of the risks of ill-advised knowledge. The Watchers' actions in this fateful story are central. They are not bad creatures per se, but animals who wanted to share the divine with man and were not wise enough to envision the full results. Satan is not to be found at the center as the prime corrupter in this story. Rather, he plays a more covert, yet equally important role. In the Ethiopian tradition, Satan is not depicted as the cause of sin, but as questioning God's actions, particularly with regard to the creation of man. He looks upon the divine scheme in question, not knowing why God raised man to such a lofty position. His questionings are not so much about his own pride, but rather about questioning the judgments that appear to place humanity above all other creatures. This paves the way for Satan's ultimate function as the accuser in the courts of heaven. His development from light-bearer, one of God's brightest angels, to a tempter is not a sudden change, but a gradual, agonizing process. The transformation of Satan's nature is tragic because it is indicative of a creature beset by profound emotional turmoil. At first, Satan's uncertainty was not born of an avowed intention to rebel against God, but out of a desire to know the will and intention of God. He was made to protect heaven's secrets, a figure of light and beauty. Yet as he watched humanity, being left with knowledge which appeared to dwarf the heavenly information he had heretofore protected, a sorrow and sense of confusion consumed his heart. His interrogation of God's choice was not an open defiance, but a silent internal struggle, with feelings of betrayal and disillusionment. As time passed, with increasing disillusionment on Satan's part, his function as the accuser began to emerge, particularly after man's fall into sin. In the Ethiopian perspective, only after man's sin does Satan fully accept his function as the adversary. His charge of humanity to God is not so much a demonstration of his pride or anger, but a lamenting recognition of the brokenness he experiences, not just within himself, but in the relationship between God and his creation. The fall of humanity becomes the ultimate impetus for Satan's full metamorphosis into the accuser, the one who opposes God's grace and mercy. This gradual metamorphosis is a central element of the Ethiopian conception of Satan. Instead of a radical rebellion against God, it is a gradual, painful process in which Satan's inner turmoil externalizes. The Watcher's establishment of forbidden knowledge serves as the catalyst that sets Satan off on his ultimate fall. Although the Watchers were motivated by a misdirected desire to bring humanity up to a higher level, their actions unintentionally legitimized the same suspicions Satan had entertained in his heart regarding God's intentions for man. The information they shared with humanity was not evil in itself. It was the abuse of that information, combined with the free will of humanity, that ultimately resulted in the corruption of the earth. Satan's position, therefore, is not that of leader of the revolt, but that of someone disillusioned by the divine purpose. His change from a light-bearer to an opponent mirrors a creature torn between the narrowness of his own comprehension and the heartache of feeling spurned by God's decisions. His attitude towards mankind is also complicated. He does not regard them as objects of hatred, but as creatures who, like him, are trapped in the web of divine choice that neither of them comprehends. His part as the accuser, thus, is not that of pure malice, but of a tragic character who is a witness to the shatteredness of creation and the penalty for forbidden knowledge. The Ethiopian view offers a more nuanced account of the evolution of Satan from being full of light and favor to the accuser of humanity. His fall is not one of proud rebellion, but of sorrow, confusion, and betrayal. His transformation, as with that of the Watchers, is a gradual process, and one which mirrors the intense emotional and relational conflicts underlying the biblical text. The corruption of humanity and the bestowing of forbidden knowledge triggered a cosmic tragedy that moves beyond simplistic moral dualism, presenting a richer and more tragic account of Satan's role within the narrative of human redemption. The Garden of Eden, according to the Ethiopian Book of Adam and Eve, is far richer, more textured in its emotional resonance than we have usually imagined through the Genesis account. Here, Satan's tempting of Eve is not the product of pure badness or revenge. It is rather a highly personal act driven by one of the most deep-seated of emotional tensions between Satan and God. Instead of seeing Satan's behaviors as merely part of a military war against God, the Ethiopian viewpoint sees them as reactions to an internal, personal struggle that had been building since his corruption. In the Ethiopian Apocrypha, we catch a glimpse of the emotional conversation between God and Satan prior to the fall of man. Satan, now no longer the faithful keeper of heaven's secrets, addresses God in bitterness and grief. He complains to God of giving precedence to mankind, mere creatures of clay, over the heavenly creatures. To Satan, this preferment of humankind appears as a betrayal, a disrespect for the heavenly creatures who have remained faithful to God. It is not so much that Satan envies man's creation. He feels resentful, as though his role in the divine scheme has been belittled. This emotional imbalance intensifies when God issues man and woman the prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge. To Satan, this prohibition is the ultimate indignity. Why must God, in his wisdom, deny knowledge to his creations? Why must they be kept in the dark while the angels have gazed and understood the entirety of heaven's secrets? With this account, Satan's temptation of Eve is more about Satan trying to show point to God rather than the temptation to sin. By causing Eve to consume from the tree that was forbidden to them, Satan is not merely trying to cause man to fall, he is doing it as a point to God. He is demonstrating to God that man too is able to know the mysteries of heaven, to have the knowledge that had been denied them. It is a defiance of God's authority, a demand that even the human creatures who had been made in God's image should be able to understand the same things that Satan himself had once understood. This is not the destruction of humanity, but rather Satan's personal grudge, a means of compelling God to deal with the apparent injustice of his decisions. The emotional complexity of Satan's motivations is evident when looking at his inner conflict. He is not a cold, calculating individual who operates with strategic efficiency. Instead, Satan is a being rent asunder by confusion, bitterness, and rejection. His war against God is not one of power or control over creation, but one of personal hurt and frustration. He had been in the presence of God once, glorious and blessed, and now he stands exiled, his rank brought low. He questions all things, God's choices, his blessing upon man, and the nature of his own existence. His temptation of Eve is, thus, not merely a tactical action to destroy God's plan, but an expression of his own personal emotional conflict. It's like Satan is saying, if I am not going to have what I had, then no one else is either. His war is personal, a rebellion not only against God's sovereignty, but against the divine plan that he cannot now accept or comprehend. When Eve succumbs to temptation and eats the fruit, it is not just the fall of mankind. It is Satan's time of proving his point, of making God recognize the disparity between his favor of man and the heavenly beings that once served him. Satan's resentment and bitterness drive the act, but also reflect his underlying emotional conflict. This act is not merely one of introducing sin into the world. It is one of making a point, an act of rebellion born of intense personal loss and rejection. The exchange between Satan and God in the Ethiopian texts portrays this struggle in a much more emotionally nuanced way than in the standard Western readings of Genesis. In the classic Christian account, Satan's temptation of Eve is portrayed as an act of rebellion against God's rule. In the Ethiopian account, though, the temptation is presented as an emotionally driven action, fueled by Satan's desire for self-justification and his wish to know where he fits into the universe. It is not that Satan despises mankind or wants to see them fall. Instead, he is trying to deal with the emotional baggage of being banished, no longer being popular, and being forced to witness mankind as the new objects of God's affection and attention. His temptation of Eve is then a cry of desperation and an attempt at emotional validation. The implications of this reinterpretation of the Garden of Eden narrative are immense. It moves the story away from the notion of Satan as a one-dimensional, evil entity hell-bent on disseminating evil to an entity grappling with profound questions of existence. His drives are in the form of loss and bewilderment, and the betrayal he experiences is not so much against God, but against the entire divine scheme that previously made sense to him. By characterizing Satan's actions as a reaction to personal loss and heartbreak, the Ethiopian tradition humanizes him, presenting his fall as not merely an issue of pride, but of an emotional wound that distorted his course. Satan's conflict against God here is then not a battle for power or control, but an epic struggle over understanding and being heard. With this image etched in viewers' minds, they start noticing that Satan's actions in Eden were not born out of a vague cosmic battle between good and evil, but due to a creature struggling with the feelings of being abandoned, rejected, and misunderstood. His tempting of Eve is a distorted expression of his own inner conflict, a plea for affirmation from a God who has apparently rejected him. Thus, Satan's battle against God is not calculated or inherently evil. It is a highly personalized battle, fueled by feelings that are all too human in their complexity. In the Ethiopian texts, the tale of Cain and Abel is a much darker and more sinister tone than is traditionally interpreted. While the Bible generally emphasizes the jealousy and wrath of Cain against his brother, the Ethiopian Apocrypha suggests Cain was somehow under the influence, if not actually manipulated, by demonic powers. This reading implies that the struggle between Cain and Abel was not only the first case of sibling rivalry, but also the start of a much broader and more malevolent spiritual conflict. It is the first time that the evil of the human heart is strongly affected by outside evil influences, driving the limits of human evil into territories previously occupied only by angels and heavenly beings. In these early writings, Cain's killing of Abel is not so much a tragic episode of jealousy and sin. It is presented as the initial expression of a greater cosmic conflict between the children of light and the children of darkness. The children of light are usually those who are on the side of divine will, while the children of darkness are those whose hearts have been corrupted by sin and evil. The Ethiopian account of this narrative adds a dynamic in which Cain is the representative of the children of darkness, consumed by jealousy, factionalism, and a self-inflated ego that distances him from the divine. His behavior is not merely individual weaknesses, but rather is perceived as the product of spiritual forces, possibly even demon influence, that manipulate his mind and heart. As Cain's narrative continues, it is evident that Satan is operating through envy, division, and pride. These are not just human feelings or weaknesses, but are perceived as the weapons of Satan, controlling Cain's mind and compelling him to violence. The corruption that starts in Cain's heart is a demonstration of the increasing presence of evil in the human world. The human state, once clean and made in the image of God, now becomes a battleground for spiritual forces, with Satan's influence increasing as humanity refuses to obey divine will. The first murder, therefore, is not merely the inability of one man to master his emotions, but the opening of a door for greater corruption and evil to permeate throughout mankind. In the broader storyline, this turn represents the source of evil moving from heaven to man's heart. At first, Satan's revolt had been based in the divine spheres, in which he fell because of pride and a lust for self-glorification. But now, with Cain, Satan's power reaches into man's very being. No longer is evil reserved for the angels or God alone. It is something that can penetrate men's and women's hearts, becoming part of the human experience. This biblical moment is the turning point at which humanity becomes aware of the constant battle between light and darkness in the human heart. The Ethiopian texts show Cain as a character whose very existence becomes an emblem of how easily human beings can be tainted by outside demonic forces. His behavior is shown to be closely entwined with Satan's increasing domination over the human race. As Cain kills Abel, it seems that the first fissure develops in the structure of humanity's relationship with God. Rather than opting to obey God's lead and example, Cain opts for the way of darkness, a move that, in this reading, is not only his own but is the result of a greater, more sinister force. The struggle between light and darkness is no longer relegated to the skies. It now occurs in the lives of human beings, and Cain's lineage is the first to be an example of this war being waged in the terrestrial world. This concept of bloodlines is also important in the Ethiopian texts. They propose that the descendants of Cain and all who go in his ways are indelibly branded by the guilt of their ancestor. It becomes a legacy of depravity which passes from generation to generation, each new generation more deeply embedded in the battle between good and evil. Satan, having been expelled from heaven, now operates through human history, employing envy, pride, and division as instruments to continue the division between the children of light and the children of darkness. The conflict between these two lineages becomes the ultimate struggle of human life, a struggle that is fought in the heart of each individual who dares to either take the road of light or take the road of darkness. The history of Cain, from an Ethiopian perspective, is not so much an antidote for jealousy and anger, as much as it is an existential truth that describes how easy it is for evil to begin to root within a man's soul, and by which mechanisms a spiritual reality would become incarnated into humanity's history. The conflict between light and darkness, between good and evil, starts not in the heavens, but in the very hearts of man. Satan's manipulation of Cain is the start of a long and tragic history wherein the corrupting of human nature is used as a means for the promotion of evil in the world. As the generations of Cain's lineage increase, so does the power of darkness on earth, and the cycle of violence, hatred, and division continues to impact humanity to date. The tale of Cain, therefore, is the sad start of a more profound spiritual struggle that will resonate down through the ages as the children of light and the children of darkness continue their never-ending struggle deep in the hearts of men. In Pur, the darkness of the ancient Shinar plains, a name blazes like a tempest against heaven, Nimrod. Defined as a powerful hunter before the Lord, Nimrod was a more than expert warrior. He was the first to use human solidarity as an instrument, leading the people to a single, rebellious voice. At his behest, a city was constructed, and in its midst, a tower to pierce the heavens. This was not merely a matter of height or ambition, it was one of rebellion. But not the sword ignited by disorder. It was structured. It was planned. It was intentional. In the Ethiopian literature, Nimrod is not just described as a rebellious king, but as a human vessel for a much older spiritual resistance. And behind him, ever in shadow, was Satan. Not openly warring this time, but echoing heaven's order in a perverted imitation. What is so provocative about the Ethiopian interpretation is that it recasts the Tower of Babel not merely as an act of prideful, human hubris, but as a false kingdom, a counterfeit Eden constructed brick by brick. Satan, having lost his bid to derail God's initial plan by way of straightforward opposition, adapts. He becomes an emulator. He empowers leaders such as Nimrod to establish societal norms that are a mimicry of divine order, but are based on control, pecking order, and domination. It's not the demolition of God's ways that he's interested in pursuing now, but their perversion. Where God provides covenant, Satan provides control. Where God welcomes worship, Satan produces obedience. The tower, in this context, becomes a symbol not only of rebellion, but of imitation, a spiritual forgery posing as human progress. Nimrod's movement to unite all people under one language and one banner might initially seem admirable. But what lies beneath, as seen through the Ethiopian lens, is a centralization of power that mirrors the heavenly throne, but without justice, without grace. The design was meant to circumvent the necessity of God entirely. Rather than scatter and disperse life as God had instructed, humanity decided to come together and make a name for themselves. Satan did not have to whisper in each ear. He simply had to encourage one man and let ambition's machinery take its course. In that deed, the human heart was moved once more, not by desire this time, but by power. Not to be evil, as during the fall, but to be gods in their own right. The Ethiopian perspective doesn't restrict Satan's power to general evil or personal sin. Rather, it visualizes him an integral part of the systems and empires built from the ruins of rebellion. Nimrod becomes the archetype, the first world ruler to adopt a model of governance that seems unified, liberal, and powerful, but is religiously empty. His definition of unity isn't rooted in love or common purpose, but in domination, compulsion, and terror. Doing so, he establishes the foundation of all empires that will succeed him: Babylon, Rome, and even contemporary institutions, all echoes of the same rebellious design. This renders Babel not only a city of yesteryear, but a recurring icon. A template Satan reuses, repackages, and reintroduces each generation. What's even more jarring is how this vision starts to connect with the world today. Modern structures of power, governments, corporations, media empires, often carry the same illusion of unity and order. But when examined closely, many of them operate on principles eerily similar to Babel: control disguised as freedom, hierarchy masquerading as equality, and dominance cloaked in the language of peace. In the Ethiopian view, these are not serendipitous evolutionary steps of civilization. They are the working out of a heavenly blueprint written centuries ago. And Satan, having discovered the ineffectiveness of overt revolt, now flourishes. By camouflaging, by imitating, by creating spiritual fakes so real they appear godly. This introduces us to a richer stratum of the tale: racial separation and the specter of empire. And so, after Babel, God dispersed men, diversifying culture and language. But Satan, ever attempting to desecrate what God makes, made diversity into division. Unity and difference did not exist. Instead, the world stratified. Race, color, and ethnicity were used to dominate. And in the centuries that followed, empire after empire rose with Nimrod's soul, wanting to unite the world not in harmony, but in a standard of superiority. From colonialism to contemporary systemic injustice, the Babel spirit and its satanic designer still shapes the way power is allocated and preserved. The Ethiopian narrative does not hesitate to make these connections. It understands history as not a haphazard sequence of human decisions, but the revelation of a spiritual conflict being waged through politics, kingship, and genealogy. Satan's brilliance is in his capacity to be invisible as his systems prosper. He does not have to use serpents to communicate anymore. He now communicates through institutions. He does not strive to destroy that which God constructs. He desires to replicate it, then poison it from within. The Tower of Babel is the initial monument to that strategy, an apparently virtuous deed cloaked in profound disobedience, a rebellion not cried aloud from rooftops, but spoken secretly through blueprints and legislation. In the story of Nimrod, The pattern of human-initiated rebellion strengthened by spiritual deception is revealed. It's a tale of pride, to be sure, but also of emulation, of Satan constructing his own kingdom of God, but with bricks rather than breath, with mortar rather than mercy. With Babel, the war of good and evil shifts out of individual hearts and into the skyscrapers of civilization. And with each rising empire, each country asserting divine right as it subjects others, comes the reverberation of Nimrod's tower once more. A haunting lesson that not all order is divine, and not all unity divine. Before the Gospels were written, the Ethiopian book of Enoch described some enigmatic man, the Son of Man, seated alongside the Ancient of Days. He would reignite the rule of kings to justice, illuminate the downtrodden, and radiate in glory, not on this earth. This vision appeared nowhere in Greek theology or Roman catacombs. It was preserved in the highlands of Ethiopia, in ancient monasteries chiseled into stone. This Son of Man, in the Ethiopic tradition, wasn't an abstract concept. He existed. He had a face, a presence, a heritage, and to the Ethiopian believers, he was one of theirs, not through an act of racial pride, but through a sacred fact. For hundreds of years, Ethiopian iconography has portrayed Jesus as a black Messiah, draped in royal apparel, crowned in gold, and surrounded by angels who look just like the people who worship him. This painting isn't revisionist. It's based on an unbroken tradition that precedes European Christianity. In Ethiopian scrolls and murals, Jesus is never some pale stranger. He is a brother, a king, a warrior of divine light. His identity is prophetic, not political. He answers the vision beheld by Enoch, the promise veiled in the Psalms, and the expectation of a Redeemer who carries fire in his eyes and love in his touch. This Christ does not only come down from heaven, he emerges out of the narrative of Africa, out of a people who never forgot the sanctity of their bond with the divine. But this black Messiah doesn't come to conquer like kings. He comes to battle something deeper, older, and much more sinister. The ancient foe, the accuser, the one who once walked in light and now dwells in darkness. Jesus' battle with Satan isn't a snapshot. It's a thread that runs throughout his entire life. From the day of his baptism, when heaven opened and the Spirit came down like a dove, the battle starts. It's not one of swords or angels fighting each other in the air. It's a battle of intentions, a battle of meaning, a battle of love. When Jesus goes into the wilderness, he confronts Satan. This is not a fight of equals, but neither is it a straightforward duel of good and evil. In the Ethiopian texts, this scene is infused with intense emotion. Satan is not merely tempting, he's begging, negotiating, almost attempting to comprehend. "If you are the Son of God," he repeats over and over. There is bewilderment behind his strategy, a frantic need to untangle what Jesus actually is. Because Satan knows power, he knows glory, but he does not know love. And in this desert, love does not yield. Love does not bend. Love hungers, thirsts, suffers, and still refuses to compromise. During his ministry, Jesus continues to face off against Satan, not always openly, but through every miracle, every parable, every act of mercy. With every soul he releases, every leper he touches, every outcast he welcomes, he tears down the power blocks Satan has established. Blocks based on fear, shame, and isolation. Jesus enters villages where demonic forces have established themselves and speaks with a power they are unable to stand against. Yet, he never attempts to eradicate Satan in wholesale fashion. Instead, he draws in the hate. He paces with the broken. He forgives the unworthy. This is not an exercise of power. This is war of love. The crucifixion is the pinnacle of this cosmic battle. Satan's hope is that the cross will shame Jesus, that pain will demonstrate his vulnerability, that death will be his silence. But what Satan cannot grasp is that love is not afraid to bleed. Love does not flee from pain. It redeems it. While Jesus is hanging on the cross, naked and being mocked, it seems like Satan has triumphed. But something unusual occurs. The temple veil rips, the sky darkens, the earth shakes, and even as Satan watches, not knowing what is happening, Jesus doesn't curse his enemies. He asks God to forgive them. Father, forgive them. This is when Satan starts to unravel. Because love, sacrificial, unbending, divine love, isn't in Satan's vocabulary, he can't calculate it, he can't turn it into a weapon, and he can't overcome it. In the Ethiopian Christian imagination, this scene isn't merely mankind's redemption, it is the vanquishing of a cosmic delusion. Satan, the once light-bearer, who was cast out because he couldn't comprehend why God would be more fond of humanity than of himself, now is confronted by that love in its naked, most divine essence, and it shatters him, not with destruction, but with exposure. The cross shows Satan he never really knew the heart of God. He was familiar with glory. He was familiar with hierarchy. He was even familiar with justice, but he never knew love. And Jesus, the Black Messiah, did not come to destroy him with thunder. He came to conquer with compassion, with surrender, with unselfish grace. The resurrection confirms this. Death, Satan's last bastion, is shattered. And Jesus does not rise with wrath, he rises with peace. He greets Mary in a garden, not with fury, but with gentleness. He walks with his disciples not in brilliance, but in kindliness. And even unto those who disbelieved, who betrayed, who deserted him, he gives nothing but love. This victory doesn't appear as triumph, it appears as restoration. Because the war was never about control, it was about relationship. The battle in the cosmos was never merely about power. It was about mending a shattered universe with love. This reinterpretation, retained in Ethiopian culture and apocalyptic literature such as the Book of Enoch, presents us with a Jesus who doesn't merely vanquish Satan, he redefines victory, a Jesus bearing the wounds of his people, a Messiah whose complexion is the earth of bygone eras, a Savior who didn't come to dominate, but to overlove. And for Satan, that is the biggest confusion of all. Because love, true love, can't be manipulated, it can't be duplicated, and it definitely can't be destroyed. Before the Gospels were written, the Ethiopian Book of Enoch described some enigmatic man, the Son of Man, seated alongside the Ancient of Days. He would reignite the rule of kings to justice, illuminate the downtrodden, and radiate in glory, not on this earth. This vision appeared nowhere in Greek theology or Roman catacombs. It was preserved in the highlands of Ethiopia, in ancient monasteries chiseled into stone. This Son of Man, in the Ethiopic tradition, wasn't an abstract concept. He existed. He had a face, a presence, a heritage, and to the Ethiopian believers, he was one of theirs, not through an act of racial pride, but through a sacred fact. For hundreds of years, Ethiopian iconography has portrayed Jesus as a Black Messiah, draped in royal apparel, crowned in gold, and surrounded by angels who look just like the people who worship him. This painting isn't revisionist, it's based on an unbroken tradition that precedes European Christianity. In Ethiopian scrolls and murals, Jesus is never some pale stranger. He is a brother, a king, a warrior of divine light. His identity is prophetic, not political. He answers the vision beheld by Enoch, the promise veiled in the Psalms, and the expectation of a Redeemer who carries fire in his eyes and love in his touch. This Christ does not only come down from heaven, He emerges out of the narrative of Africa, out of a people who never forgot the sanctity of their bond with the divine. But this Black Messiah doesn't come to conquer like kings. He comes to battle something deeper, older, and much more sinister. The ancient foe, the accuser, the one who once walked in light and now dwells in darkness. Jesus' battle with Satan isn't a snapshot. It's a thread that runs throughout his entire life. From the day of his baptism, when heaven opened and the Spirit came down like a dove, the battle starts. It's not one of swords or angels fighting each other in the air. It's a battle of intentions, a battle of meaning, a battle of love. When Jesus goes into the wilderness, he confronts Satan. This is not a fight of equals, but neither is it a straightforward duel of good and evil. In the Ethiopian texts, this scene is infused with intense emotion. Satan is not merely tempting, he's begging, negotiating, almost attempting to comprehend. "If you are the Son of God," he repeats, over and over. There is bewilderment behind his strategy, a frantic need to untangle what Jesus actually is. Because Satan knows power, he knows glory, but he does not know love. And in this desert, love does not yield. Love does not bend. Love hungers, thirsts, suffers, and still refuses to compromise. During his ministry, Jesus continues to face off against Satan, not always openly, but through every miracle, every parable, every act of mercy. With every soul he releases, every leper he touches, every outcast he welcomes, he tears down the power blocks Satan has established. Blocks based on fear, shame, and isolation. Jesus enters villages where demonic forces have established themselves and speaks with a power they are unable to stand against. Yet he never attempts to eradicate Satan in wholesale fashion. Instead, he draws in the hate. He paces with the broken. He forgives the unworthy. This is not an exercise of power. This is war of love. The crucifixion is the pinnacle of this cosmic battle. Satan's hope is that the cross will shame Jesus. That pain will demonstrate his vulnerability. That death will be his silence. But what Satan cannot grasp is that love is not afraid to bleed. Love does not flee from pain. It redeems it. While Jesus is hanging on the cross, naked and being mocked, it seems like Satan has triumphed. But something unusual occurs. The temple veil rips, the sky darkens, the earth shakes. And even as Satan watches, not knowing what is happening, Jesus doesn't curse his enemies. He asks God to forgive them. "Father, forgive them." This is when Satan starts to unravel. Because love, sacrificial, unbending, divine love, isn't in Satan's vocabulary. He can't calculate it. He can't turn it into a weapon, and he can't overcome it. In the Ethiopian Christian imagination, this scene isn't merely mankind's redemption. It is the vanquishing of a cosmic delusion. Satan, the once light-bearer, who was cast out because he couldn't comprehend why God would be more fond of humanity than of himself, now is confronted by that love in its naked, most divine essence. And it shatters him, not with destruction, but with exposure. The cross shows Satan he never really knew the heart of God. He was familiar with glory. He was familiar with hierarchy. He was even familiar with justice. But he never knew love. And Jesus, the Black Messiah, did not come to destroy him with thunder. He came to conquer with compassion, with surrender, with unselfish grace. The resurrection confirms this. Death, Satan's last bastion, is shattered. And Jesus does not rise with wrath. He rises with peace. He greets Mary in a garden, not with fury, but with gentleness. He walks with his disciples, not in brilliance, but in kindliness. And even unto those who disbelieved, who betrayed, who deserted him, he gives nothing but love. This victory doesn't appear as triumph. It appears as restoration. Because the war was never about control. It was about relationship. The battle in the cosmos was never merely about power. It was about mending a shattered universe with love. This reinterpretation, retained in Ethiopian culture and apocalyptic literature such as the Book of Enoch, presents us with a Jesus who doesn't merely vanquish Satan. He redefines victory. A Jesus bearing the wounds of his people. A Messiah whose complexion is the earth of bygone eras. A Savior who didn't come to dominate, but to overlove. And for Satan, that is the biggest confusion of all. Because love, true love, can't be manipulated. It can't be duplicated. And it definitely can't be destroyed. He was once light. Not only a bearer of it, but a walking flame who walked among the sacred stones, draped in gems and secret, exhaling adoration with each thought. Before he was Satan, the adversary, the accuser, he was Hillel, the light bringer, the creature whose name held the weight of divine trust, whose office brought him close to the throne. He didn't fall in an instant, he unraveled over time, not out of some two-dimensional lust for evil, but out of a crack in love, a crack we don't often comprehend. His tale, pieced together from ancient Ethiopian manuscripts and concealed scrolls, isn't one of a monster bred in darkness. It's one of a son opting for exile, rather than for surrender. It's one of pride that had started as agony. When humanity was formed, made from the ground and yet sanctified with air from the mouth of God, Hillel observed, not with anger in the beginning, but with a question. Why them? Why these mortal bodies tethered to the soil when angels glided through fire and song? That same question, why them, slowly transmuted to, why not me? And that is where most wars get their start. What if the enemy we feared was once our family? That is the question this narrative compels us to pose. For when you actually trace the path of the enemy, when you strip away the demon visage we've imposed upon him, you have something discomforting. You have a wound. An individual who was unable to approve God's decision to exalt the lowly. An individual who was not able to stoop his knee to dust. That was the original transgression. Not power, but status. Not evil, but pain. And so who is the true enemy? The one who rebelled? Or the deafness that refuses to look on the other as deserving? Satan, in Ethiopian theology, wasn't ejected like trash. He walked himself away. When he prioritized ego over relationship, he cut himself off. And by doing that, he became the mirror of all those who have ever valued separation over integration. Let's get this closer. If the enemy was once the beloved, then how do we treat the enemies in our own lives? Racism, religious hatred, political violence, exile of the other. These are not new sins. They are reflections of the first war in heaven. When we exclude another because they don't look like us, think like us, believe like us, we tread the path of Hillel, because that's what he did. He watched God love something foreign, and he couldn't handle it. And here's where it stings the worst. If we had been where he was, would we have done otherwise? Contemporary enemies are forged from tales, hurt, misperceptions, and primordial fears. All racist epithets, all religious strife, all hate barriers, they all derive from one instant, when someone thought their value was higher than someone else's. That is Satan's true heritage. Not pitchforks and horns, but pride masquerading as virtue. But Christ broke that cycle, and not with lightning, with love. The Black Messiah, it is imagined in Ethiopian iconography, does not come to earth, riding thunder. He comes swaddled in humility, born among the outcasts, baptized in muddy waters, seduced by Satan himself not to kill the foe, but to love more deeply in the face of treachery. When he hangs upon the cross, battered and left alone, he gazes at his killers and utters the words which annihilate the real enemy eternally. Father, forgive them. He doesn't expose Rome. He doesn't kill Judas. He loves them. Even Satan doesn't get curses from his mouth. Why? Because Jesus knew the truth. The war was never fought over strength. It was fought over hearts, and love, true love, is the only weapon that ever ends a war. This is where the story leaves us transformed, because once we've witnessed the tragedy of Satan's fall, the grief for his rebellion, the gradual fall from light to darkness, we can no longer embrace hate in the same manner. We can no longer gaze upon the individuals we deem enemies and be clean in that designation. If Satan was once loved, what about the people we demonize today? Who is the true enemy? Perhaps it's not a horned figure. Perhaps it's the unwillingness to forgive. Perhaps it's the satisfaction we derive from dehumanizing another. Perhaps it's the voice in our culture that dictates only the strong are important. Perhaps it's the silence when the weak are destroyed. Jesus doesn't finger point at Satan when he instructs us on what to do. He points at us. Love your enemies. That wasn't a figure of speech. That was war tactics, divine tactics, the kind that dismantles kingdoms of darkness because it isn't afraid to lose face. The kind that walks into death to bring forth resurrection. And that's why Christ won. Not because he was more powerful, but because he was more loving. This isn't about facts. It's about vision. It's about letting go of the simple labels. It's about understanding that truth, true truth, is greater than data. It's revelation. And revelation transforms the way we view the world, the way we view our enemies, the way we view ourselves. The story we've unfolded using Ethiopian wisdom, sacred scripture, and secret traditions is not so much a history of heaven and hell. It's a mirror. And if you look into it, you may see that the true fight was never between God and Satan only. It's between each heart that must choose to love or to accuse, to serve or to separate, to build or to burn. So if this opened your eyes, leave a super thanks and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Bible Says. We go deeper than others dare.